Hello and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 97, Lessons of the Franciscan Way, applicable for today. So this was a essay that was written by Murray Rothbard back, I believe, in the 90s, about this book that was written by Samuel Francis, called Beautiful Losers. So you can see that up on the screen there. And Murray Rothbard's the one with the yellow background, and Francis is the one with the, I guess, door in the background on the screen. So the idea behind this book, as far as I understand it, coming through the essay, was it wanted to come up with ideas and strategies for how to actually affect change within society and kind of look at, well, okay, the left has been very effective at these various things. Why have they been effective? Things like that. So it kind of goes into that. So I read through the article. It's about 13 pages long. I'll link it in the description if you guys want to read it. It's a pretty easy read. But I had some thoughts on it, and I thought this would be a good topic for the podcast. So it seemed like, well, maybe that's not accurate, but the idea was to kind of create a movement, right? So another example of that kind of thing would be like the populist movement. They were mainly looking at 19th century movements, so the populist movement was end of the 18th century. So they're looking at kind of the left's Marxist type movements that they've seen rise up within their lifetime, and then also the what book is it? Kind of the conservative reaction to that, and what have they been effective? Have they not been effective? Answer, of course, is they haven't been effective because the conservatives conserve nothing. But early on, one thing that he had pointed out was the iron law of oligarchy. I don't remember where he said that came from. He cites almost everything as he's writing here. But basically the idea behind that is every organization will be run by a small elite of its most able, interested, and energetic members. And I thought that was interesting because if I look at like kind of politics today and maybe why somebody doesn't want to get involved, why I maybe don't want to get involved, it seems like a drag, and that almost seems like by design for me, because as we can see, the way that America is being run, it's not being run by its best and brightest, right? It's not being run by the most able-bodied, but interested and energetic is an interesting two other corollaries to that, because okay, maybe they're not the most able, but they are the most interested in that topic, and they are the most energetic about that topic. And that's probably going to beat you out over able-bodied a lot of times. When you look at people who are successful, a lot of times it's not necessarily that they're the best in the certain field. It's that they were willing to try more often, or that they had a passion for it above and beyond what other people had. So I find it interesting that the current elite maintain power even if they are not the most able. They are the most interested and energetic. They maintain this monopoly by intentionally making law and other aspects uninteresting to the greater public. That's me probably just projecting because I find it kind of boring. Though I do listen to a law podcast all the time. So I don't know. Do I find it interesting? Do I not? I don't want to sit there and tediously read through like a 900-page document. I remember saying if I ever became president or got into a position of power, my first law would be, or executive order would be, you can't write a bill more than like 20 pages so I can actually flip and read the thing in a reasonable time. Either that, or maybe it's just the nature of running government where you have to have like these long, tedious things. Because if you think about just think about Magic the Gathering is a good example. I think about all the times where you're trying to play a card or something like that, and you play two different cards, and they got these crazy interactions. You got to go look up some rule book somewhere of like the million extra rules of like how these things interact, because there's such weird like edge cases and stuff like that. And a lot of times that's why law becomes so cumbersome and stuff like that, is because you write a law, you have this kind of intention, and then people always try to push the boundaries. People always game theory it and try to push the limits of what they can kind of get away with, and see, how does this law actually play out? And it's a good thing because it kind of tests and reinforces or makes rigid the law, but then it becomes cumbersome because you have all this case law and all this other stuff that you have to kind of understand to even get to that point. So I remember I read a book one time. I think it was by Lind, about like fourth generation warfare. I think it's called Victoria. And the first like half the book's amazing. Like really energetic. Like you get sucked in. But one of the things that was I found kind of funny in the book was they made laws so that they wouldn't be complicated, and that so anybody like you didn't need lawyers anymore, and anyone could represent themselves. And that sounds nice in a sense. And if you kept the community small enough, that would work. But the matter of the fact is, as communities get to a certain size, and when uh, when these laws that seem very basic end up becoming more and more complicated because you have these edge cases of like, okay, well, here's kind of an in-between case, or here's like an outlier that doesn't really fall underneath the law but kind of does, and all that stuff needs to get sorted. It ends up creating a need for a lawyer, even if you didn't want one. So I mean, it was a fantasy book, so it's not like the end of the world, but or not fantasy, but fiction. Um, Not the end of the world, but uh, you know, this is why systems become more bureaucratic and cumbersome over time, and eventually usually end up creating laws that kind of contradict themselves and things like that, and why you devolve from a rule of law to uh, law by rulers, which the rulers in this, in at least in America's case, is the judges that just get to decide anything that they want, because there like there's so much case law and there's so much stuff that just contradicts itself that you can't actually be consistent on anything, and there's no basis. So they just basically get to decree by fiat what is and what isn't correct. That is wildly off what the actual article talks about, but those are my thoughts on stuff. Um, One other interesting thing that came up pretty early on was the idea of elite circulation. And, Rothbard being kind of anarcho-capitalist, kind of believing in that idea, he believed that the free market was the best way for elites to cycle, because if you look at entrepreneurs, they usually cycle pretty quickly, and they cycle based on providing people what they actually want. And he saw that governments didn't really cycle that often. The elites in that area didn't cycle very often, and led to stagnation and stuff like that. And in that sense, I agree with him. But I think some of those things need to be tamed, because if we've seen with these international corporations and stuff like that, it's not all good. There's some bad stuff that has come with that. And so some of these interests need to be curtailed for the interest of the nation. So uh, basically, he's right that elites in government don't get rotated often enough, and that can lead to a stagnation and an issue within that group. Um, so we need to create a system in which they do kind of have some rotation and pressure that the entrepreneurs in the free market kind of experience, but is still within that realm. I don't I don't know exactly what that system would look like, but that's kind of the basis for the system that you should be looking to do. And then also making sure that the national interest stay uh, at its forefront, meaning that you can't allow foreign elites, to get into that cycle for governmental power. And the other one, leave entrepreneurial um, capitalists to try to make and provide things in the free market as best they can, and let that turnover happen as well, but keep them in check, kind of like what China's doing today, where uh, the businesses have to serve the interest of the nation. You can't just become extremely wealthy and then ship all of your factory jobs off to China or some other low labor cost country. You have to do things to make it so that you can maintain that. And it's also incumbent on the elites within the government to work with those corporations as well, to make sure that they don't overly regulate and burden them to the point that they can't succeed within their own nation. But the more autarkic that you can kind of make your economy, the more resilient you are to shocks and stuff like that, the less need you need to get involved in foreign affairs and things like that. You are overall a stronger, more independent nation the more you can do that. Now, most nations can't pull that off because they're just not, they don't have the landmass and the natural resources available to them to be able to do that. But a couple nations that could pull that off is America and Russia for sure. Maybe China. The oil thing's the biggest thing with China. I don't know if they have any good sources of oil within their country. Um, but they have the land mass, at least, to potentially have all of the various natural resources that they could potentially need. Do they have them all? I don't know. Then he kind of gets into the managerial elite idea, and this is kind of what we're going to talk about for most of the rest of the podcast here. Um, so the idea behind the managerial elite, which is a very astute observation, is that after World War II, basically, or actually it wasn't, it was called the managerial revolution, is what he called it, and the idea that more and more of the jobs and functions within a society became bureaucratic and had all of these cushy um, administrative type jobs and things like that. HR departments got developed and bloated and all this stuff. When I was first kind of listening to it, and I mean, I don't have him to talk to me, and it wasn't exactly clear through the text, but there seems to be two lines. So there's that he could have been thinking about this. So there's the line of kind of the corporate cancer angle that Vox Day talked about, and we'll talk about how that relates to what he was discussing here. And then there's just like general administration stuff. So I'm guessing he's not talking about general administration stuff, but I wrote something down about it anyway, so I'm going to tell you about it. Um, so it uh, so adding all these managerial jobs certainly adds to the cumbersome and the bureaucracy within a system. But if you want the current economy that we have, that is interdependent as ours, that is able to produce highly complex and precise machines that kind of compound on each other. This precise machine allows the production of this more precise machine, which, those kind of things require vast arrays of um, networks and trade and world stuff. So as bad as globalization has been, there are aspects of it where, these high precision machines and stuff like that have been something that have been able to come out of it. Can we still have those kind of things without needing to pull on the resources of all of the world? Yes, but I think it would take us longer to get to that point. Which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just it's a trade-off. Um, but I think to have an advanced economy like that and not one that has all this administration and stuff like that is kind of inevitable, because I worked at a place that tried to run a company with no administration or processes, and it did produce parts and it was profitable, but what it did produce and what it could have produced, there was a massive gap there. And without those kind of administrative or managerial elite type people that in those places, or managerial revolution that he kind of saw, I don't think he would have been able to implement things like lean manufacturing and stuff like that. It's not like they didn't have engineers before World War II though, so probably not exactly what he's talking about. And he's mainly probably talking about the useless jobs or useless tasks. There's some YouTube channel, I forgot the name of it, but he had a video on like useless jobs, basically things that you are just doing that are there to just kind of keep you busy. A good example is the TPS reports from the Office Space, I think is the movie. Just a useless piece of paperwork that no one's going to check or read or whatever, and it's busy work to kind of fill up your 40 hours, because there isn't actually 40 hours worth of productive work for you to do, and so they just have you waste your time on these menial, pointless tasks. But you get paid well for it, and it's something that kind of eats at your soul. Because I know I had a job that there were certain aspects of it that felt like that, and it never felt like I was having the impact that I needed for the amount of money that I was getting paid, kind of thing. And I don't know if that kind of guilt is some way that they control people, to where it's like, oh, you don't want to go along with this, like, where are you going to get paid to do, this nonsense kind of job as well, kind of thing, so that way you can pressure people with various things like mass and other nonsense. But that's kind of a digression from what we were actually talking about. But the thing that he did touch on a little bit later was he discussed the managerial elite actually sounds like a corporate cancer in a sense that has converged and is serving the narrative and not the customers of the business. And this is something that we've seen a lot, especially since wokeism has kind of taken over the corporate and just kind of cultural zeitgeist, let's say. Um, but interestingly, he didn't see them kind of taking over in the way they did. So, which in the 90s, like in the 90s, I don't know how you would have seen this kind of thing coming. Maybe you could have, but I'm not aware of anybody that saw kind of woke culture erupting as it did. Um, so he didn't think that could happen because he didn't think wokeism. Uh, wait, what? He did not foresee the rise of wokeism and did not think that investors could be cowed by the woke mob or by their propaganda that hurt the bottom line. So he's like, investors, their main motive is profit and money and stuff like that, and they're not just gonna take a loss just because some crazy hippie or whatever called them racist or something like that. Turns out, yes, they will. And there's other aspects for it that I'm sure Rothbard would have recognized had he been alive today, kind of thing, where there's various governmental incentives and things like that to kind of conform to this. Um, well, I don't. Well, I do think libertarians overprescribe. It's the fault of the government to things. There have been various little things throughout uh, that subtle things that the government has been doing to kind of coerce investors or other entrepreneur type people to kind of kowtow to things like wokeism or other cultural type things that have been happening. He also underestimated how brazen the managerial class would be, claiming that a gardener at the Rockefeller estate would never be so bold as to override the will of the estate owner and plant the garden as they saw fit, despite the objections from the actual owner of the garden. However, we have seen repeatedly where the SJW does something outrageous, and when the CEO tries to punish them, the CEO finds that he is the one that is out the door. So, we've seen this kind of over and over. So his example was Gardner and Rockefeller. Rockefeller would be like, "Oh, don't plant that," or "I want this tree moved over here," and then they'd come back and be like, "Oh, so you think blah blah blah, call him racist," and then somehow Rockefeller's thrown out of his own estate, or some weird thing where he has to sell the property. Not the perfect example, but we've seen a lot of those kind of things. So it's interesting that he was kind of discussing these things and couldn't imagine our culture devolving to a point where that kind of stuff would happen. But that is kind of where we're at right now, which is interesting to kind of see that he was looking ahead. And he did acknowledge later on that this could potentially happen, but he didn't. There was nothing at the time to indicate how that might develop or something like that. And so he's like, basically, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And I think that's a fine response to that concern in the 90s at the time, which was 30 years ago now. And then to kind of continue on, the main thing he did not see developing was how effectively the woke mob could instill fear in the hearts of those who were supposedly in charge. It is quite reminiscent of when the mob in Rome would get whooped up and all the senators would have to flee. It's not as violent, obviously, that people's lives aren't at risk, but that kind of Twitter mob, as it were, does happen quite often within this paradigm. Though at the very end, he does mention that one of the reasons that this couldn't function is because they wouldn't be doing basically the core function of the corporation. They wouldn't be doing that, so there'd be no use for them, so they would get fired and stuff like that. And we've kind of seen with Google and Apple, like these people are kind of running the show, and that isn't really happening. But the thing is, it's not that they aren't useful to the company, because they're not useful to the company, but they're kept on anyway because of I don't know, propaganda. Let's just call it that. But they do serve someone else's purpose, which is another reason why they're in there. Rothbard assumed that purpose would be to be creating a successful company. However, the actual objective seems to be tearing down Western civilization and Christianity. Once they have served their purpose, they will be tossed aside like all of the devil's minions. And we definitely haven't reached that point within our societal degradation collapse kind of thing, but we're getting there. It's slow march towards awfulness. Let's call it that. One other very interesting thing that he brings up is that uh, he basically brings up the exact same question that Machiavelli brings up in his discourses. So one of those questions is, who is a better arbiter and better at maintaining the society? And his thing was maintaining freedom and stuff like that. But basically, his whole thing was, how do we get back to what America used to be, what America was founded on, its principles, its ideas of freedom and stuff like that. And he said the best people to maintain that are the masses and not the elite, masses, the general populace. Um, and Machiavelli's was the exact opposite. It was the elite. His examples were Venice and Sparta. Uh, and I actually think they're both right, but you have to add a little bit of context as to why they're both right. So Rothbard, when he's looking at this, is looking at it from a perspective of the current regime and how everything's kind of degraded and stuff like that, and how the will of the people isn't being enacted and the national interest isn't being looked out for, and the core tenets of what the country was founded on aren't being followed. So in that regard, uh, the and the reason for that is the elites that are running America aren't American. So if but the people that are demanding the things be done in the interest of the nation are American, and therefore they are a better arbiter for what should be done and the prescriptions for the current problems that are being faced right now than the people that are in charge at the current juncture. Machiavelli's analysis is correct if both the nation and the um, if the elite are from the nation from which they are ruling, because the elite of that have were either built the society and therefore know better how to maintain said society, or they are the descendants of that and therefore are better set to maintain the society. On top of the fact that um, when the masses try to get power, they generally try to take more than they can give. Not that they can give, but where are we? The masses are only interested in amassing more power and resources for themselves when they get into power. This is seen throughout. You can see it in Athens' democracy and things like that. An overall concern for the health of the governmental structure that is being done. A part of the reason for this is the responsibility for maintaining the structure is widely distributed amongst basically the whole populace, making it so everyone assumes it's someone else's problem. While the windfall from the power and resources extracted is beneficial directly to the individual. This makes it so no one maintains the actual structure, and basically an extraction happens from on the society wise, and it creates a deleterious effect where it ends up crumbling the society over the long term. It can take a while, especially if things are kind of kept in check. Rome's a great example. I've been reading a book on Sulla, so it's kind of forefront in my mind of how their system worked. But it's also kind of what the American system was based on, so it's a good example to kind of go back and pull from, because you had the tribunes and the Senate, and over time the tribune got more and more power, but the Senate was able to kind of as a balance to that and kind of able to wrest some of that control back, and then eventually when some of the dictators and stuff like that came, Sulla as such kind of reset that to where they greatly diminished the power of the tribune. Not didn't get rid of it, but kind of put it back to the level that it should be at, and gave the organization and maintenance of society back to the Senate. Now, one of the reasons it got that bad is because the Senate was doing a bad job of actually maintaining the society in which they were done. There's a lot of corruption and stuff like that, things we are all too familiar with today. But it was rather interesting. Um, so then Rothbard gets into highlighting the failures of conservatism. Especially striking is his assessment that the liberal revolution happened in 1938 with the New Deal, and goes to highlight that the adage that conservatives are liberals driving the speed limit. So basically, he's talking about how all these people are conservatives standing upon the mountaintop yelling "stop," and in reality, the train's already passed them, and so then they turn around and they're like, well, I guess I gotta get with the program and yell stop. And then, the same thing happens with everything that's going forward. A lot of the reason for this that he diagnoses is um, the revolutionaries are proactive and conservatives are reactive, and you're not getting anything done if you're reactive. That's why I think it's very important to kind of, uh, you know, to get stuff and take our culture and dial things back, and not dial things back, but reset them and rebuild. We have to kind of change. We can't be reactionaries. We have to be restorationists. We have to restore what things were built. That means you're going to be tearing a lot of stuff down. And you're going to have to rebuild a lot of stuff from the ground up. You're going to have to gut a lot of stuff and leave just the whatever cultural framing was there, and then kind of rebuild the structure around it. Maybe in some instances you got to tear the whole thing down because the whole thing's rotted all the way to the core and to the foundation. In that case, then you have to tear the whole thing down and rebuild the whole thing. That's kind of on a base by base thing. But the barbarians aren't at the walls; they're inside the walls already, and it's time to expel them. Rothbard, interestingly, is against a Caesarist or Sullian strategy to restore the rule of law. I am of the opposite opinion. That is one of the only ways of getting any semblance of the Republic back. Leaving the sorting of this to Congress runs afoul of the same issue that I talked about with the elites versus the masses. Question from earlier. Responsibility for action is too widely distributed, and if Congress fails to take action, they cannot be held to account as the blame is too dispersed. Thus, the executive is the only one who can restore and then return power to Congress to maintain it, which they are much more capable of doing. Interestingly, Rothbard acknowledges that to drain the swamp, as Trump had kind of said, it were... Oh, I do have a lot more to talk about. Okay. It would take a leader like Lenin or Pol Pot, or the examples he used. I like to use Sulla as an example. With steely determination. For me, that means won't balk at the need for executions. Otherwise, they end up subsumed by the state apparatus. The example he used was Reagan in his day. In ours, it's Trump. At the time, he did not see anyone that could take the mantle of a Lenin type character or a Sulla type character. And 30 years later, I don't think that has changed. I don't see anybody out there politically that could take up the mantle. It seemed like Trump might be that person, but when he, actually, January 6th, the 1 year anniversary of that is tomorrow, and when he kind of failed to act that day, it was, that was kind of the make or break day. So that was pretty disappointing, let us just say. He goes on to also point out that leftists like Marxists also almost never concern themselves with theory and are all about strategy. They're a group of action, not words. Conservatives and libertarians, by contrast, are all talk, no action. He doesn't say those exact things, but that's basically the gist of it that he gets at. He also starts to end up talking about McCarthyism and stuff like that, and how various, and also Pat Buchanan and stuff like that, and the people who are effective against the left are the ones who get the flack. If you aren't getting flack, that means you aren't over the target, and that means you're not doing your job right. If you're not being called a Nazi or a fascist or something like that by the left, that means you are playing directly into your hand, which makes it really easy to tell whether or not you're doing something correctly. It's a good guiding principle, let's call it. Rothbard sees McCarthy as being effective at taking down the establishment and left, and is now why, and it is because of that now why mentioning him is in a good light is considered verboten. Thus, this offers us an example with the American legal framework as a basis of strategy of a similar effectiveness. So that was kind of a whole mouthful. Basically, McCarthyism threatened the leftist establishment and the communists that had kind of snuck their way into the reigns of power during the 1950s, 1960s, and stuff like that. I think he was 50s. Um, and so we should go back and study what McCarthy did and kind of um, look at some strategies and stuff like that, uh, and effective tools that he used within our legal framework to affect the kind of change that he wanted to see. As we could see with the reaction to him that he was over the target and he was considered a threat to them, and therefore um, is an effective tool to be used. There's other good examples throughout the history of Sulla and um, Trump, and not Trump. There's other examples throughout history that I'm currently blanking on a bunch of their names, but um, they aren't within the legal framework of America. So it takes a little bit more understanding of how that would be adapted to our current situation. Due to this being within our legal framework, it's a much more plug and play kind of strategy. And be like, okay, these are the strategies he's used. Let's just take those, run with them, and see what we can kind of do and affect. And it's kind of a quick way that you can just kind of get without having to have a long strategy meeting of what you're going to do. You can be like, all right, this is the strat we're going to take. It's already been established that it works. Let's go. So Rothbard, in recounting of the left's reaction to McCarthy, sounds very, very similar to the shrieking done by the left when Trump was elected, which is kind of interesting. And they did everything they could to crush McCarthy. They're doing a similar thing with Trump. And well, McCarthy apparently had a long, successful history after they tried to crush him in politics. We'll see what happens with Trump here, but time will tell. Rothbard concludes that McCarthy's ability to start a counter-revolution to the establishment left was by being able to clearly communicate the threat to the average person was one of the reasons for this reaction. So being able to get the average person, to kind of see and understand, and not that they didn't ever really care, their minds are shut off, but he's an effective communicator. Another similarity, interestingly, to Trump. That was one of the things, is he communicated effectively with his base, the everyman kind of thing, the blue collar worker type. He could communicate effectively with those, and McCarthy had a similar ability to communicate. Hey, they got all this fancy mumbo jumbo, and they're doing all this propaganda and rhetoric and stuff like that to throw you off your case. Here's the clear cut truth of what's going on. Here's some simple A, B, and C of understanding what's going on, and it just cuts through their stuff. Truth is the most effective rhetoric, but it has to be. It still has to be couched in an emotional appeal to be rhetoric. It can't be dialectic. Then, interestingly, he goes into equality and how it was used. It's been used as a weapon to cut down barriers. I would go a step farther in saying that freedom is a similar thing that is used to either make it so those people of equality, the barriers are never raised in the first place, because they'd be like, oh, you can't shut me out because that's against freedom of speech or something like that, or are themselves also weapons used to tear down things. They use freedoms to be able to do debaucherous and deleterious things, and then use that to tear down the institutions in which those freedoms were granted, and then remove said freedoms from people. We see this all the time. Basically, all of social media is living proof of how this works. The advantage the right has over the left is that it can build, while the left must act as a parasite. As we can see in the modern America, it has a tendency to kill its host. So that is that's kind of the white pill. Is it the hopeful message I want to kind of leave this overall thing on is, if you can build, then it doesn't matter what the parasites can do, because they can't live without hosts. As long as you keep the parasites out of the thing that you built, which is the hard part, then they will die. They'll suck their current host dry, and then they'll wither and die. And that's kind of the interesting thing that we're facing today. And that's why the idea of the parallel economy is such a good idea, and such a effective way of kind of navigating this, because for one, it goes completely around the entire political system that they have control of, and so they can't use any of their parasitic systems to suck it dry, as long as those people that are building that parallel economy stand strong, stand firm, and make sure that none of the grifters and other people, the parasites, don't allow them into the system. That's something that's hard to maintain over a very long period of time. Doing it within a generation, 2 generations is usually doable, but we will see overall how long that can be maintained. Right now it's being built, so that is something that's got to be done, and something that I should probably also be working on. This is why corruption is inherently parasitic. It's slow. It's a slow process. While removing said corruption is a much quicker process, because it's just, you got to clear it all out at once. If you don't clear it all out at once, it's gonna just re-corrupt the whole thing and rot it away. The example I like to use is a building that's got rot in it. You have to, if you don't have to knock down the whole building, you got to rip out all the spots with rot, and you do that all at once. Make sure that you get down to the spots that don't have any rot with, and then you just build right back up from there. And so even the clearing out of a corruption ends up being at its core a building process. Does it have some destructive elements to it? Yeah. You have to carve away the corruption. You have to dig and get to the root of the problem and make sure that you're building on a solid foundation. But once you get there, it's not, continuously tearing down or whatever. It's a building process again. And so that kind of wraps it up. I thought it was a very interesting article. I'll leave that there for you guys to read if you're interested in it. If you thought this was interesting, like, share, subscribe. I'm on YouTube. I'm on BitChute. I'm on all the podcast things: Podbean, Apple, Google. I've basically subscribed to all of them. So they're wherever you want to get your podcast. That's where they are available. But thank you guys for listening, and I hope you have a good day. Goodbye.